You live.
Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're talking about wood movement. Those times when the board just moves you. Okay, enough of that.
We don't want to hear about your movement.
Yes, this is one of these topics that really scares people. There's a lot of myths and legends that go on with it, and the idea of furniture that might explode on you if it's not put together correctly. And I want to kind of go through and make this a little bit simpler, make it something that you can easily understand. Because once you understand what wood movement is and how it actually works, everything becomes a little bit simpler and easier to understand when people are talking about it. So it's one of these topics that you gotta kind of wrap your brain around. But once you get that, everything else suddenly clicks and it makes a lot more sense for a lot of other things in woodworking, and particularly different types of joinery and why we do them the way we do them. So, yeah, we're going to be doing that. Couple notes of things coming up. My wife and I have decided that we're soon going to be doing a build series with her building her own bench. And she's going to build it all by herself, and we're going to do a whole build series on how does a beginner build a bench without a bench. We're going to make a very simple knockdown Moravian, a Windsor workbench. That sounds kind of interesting, really wobbly, but okay.
It's very royal.
Royal?
Never
Oh,
mind.
Windsor Castle. It's a different type of style, but yes. A Moravian workbench will be knocked down, so it'll be at her height, but then I can put risers underneath it if I need to travel with it. So that should be a lot of fun. We'll probably do some of those with the live videos, but we will be having a full build series. It'll be geared towards first-time woodworkers. Okay, you just got a couple tools. How do you make a bench without a bench? Be a rather simple and fun design. So I'm looking forward to that coming up. Is that a super chat I see?
It is a super chat.
Woohoo! Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Yes, he says to support the wood movement, equal rights for soft and hard woods.
Yes. Protests get naughty. Do you have a mom joke?
Do I have a mom joke?
Here it comes,
I
folks.
have a mom joke? All right. I'm trying to find a good one. What do you call a snobbish criminal going down the stairs?
A snobbish criminal going down the stairs. What?
A condescending con descending.
That one wins. I like that. So, a couple other things coming up. I'm hoping, if everything comes today, the last video in the series for the Impossible Coffee Table will be this weekend. So I have it all sitting over here, and let me show you. It's getting ready. I did all of the smoothing on it. And so we just glued on the two arches, and so hopefully we'll be doing some of the cable work on it later tonight, and to get that up. So those will be coming up here very, very shortly. And for those of you who are patrons or members, make sure you check the feed. I just put something in there today that you might not want to miss. So check that out. If you're on Patreon, go to the Patreon feed and you'll see it there. If you're a member here on YouTube, look through the community section on the channel and you'll see a notification there. So yay, stay tuned. Everyone else will find out about it tomorrow. Yeah, so that's that. So let's dive into wood movement. Now, before we get into this, you really need to understand, you need to take it back to the tree and what all is going on in the tree itself. So here I have a log that I've used to try and explain this several times. And what you can see is you've got the log here. And as the log dries, so you've got a really, really wet log, and you take it and you cut it, and all the moisture starts to evaporate out, it shrinks. And so as the moisture leaves, the wood shrinks. And this is the first thing you need to understand about wood movement. Wood movement, all it is expansion and contraction, or expansion and contraction. If wood heats up, it expands. If it cools down, it shrinks. If you add moisture to it, it expands. If you take moisture away, it shrinks. That's all wood movement is. Wood movement isn't like it moves. It is actually just expansion and contraction of the wood. So if you've got this log and you cut it down, It's going to look like a log until it starts to dry. And as it starts to dry, you're going to notice that there is this crack here. And you'll see other checks coming out, and they all radiate from the middle. And what happens is that the wood expands and contracts in a radial pattern. It doesn't expand and contract wholly. It expands and contracts along the rings. So if you imagine rings going around here, each of those rings gets smaller. And because the rings on the outside are bigger, there is more of them to move. And so the outside contracts far more than the inside. The inside only contracts a little bit. So if we've got this log, which is about 10 inches across, so that means that there's about a 3 foot of diameter around this. Actually, it's a little less than 3 foot. So in the whole contraction of this, it is contracted about 3/8 of an inch over 3 foot of movement. And that will make a lot more sense here in a little bit. But you need to understand that wood expands and contracts radially. It doesn't expand and contract across. It doesn't expand and contract endwise. It expands and contracts along the rays. Now, the other thing you need to understand is that wood does not expand and contract lengthwise. So if I've got a board here, this board does not expand and contract this way. So the length of the board is the length of the board. Yes, there will be a very, very minuscule, tiny amount of expansion and contraction. If you have a board 30, 40 feet long, then you might have to think about its expansion and contraction lengthwise, but you're not going to have to think about it that much. And if any board is around 4 to 5 to 8 feet long, expansion and contraction isn't even going to come into the calculation because it's well within the compression ratio of the wood. So wood does not expand and contract lengthwise. It only expands and contracts along the radial axis. But our boards are not round. Our boards are flat. And that's why I have all of this drawn here on the end. Different cuts of boards are going to work in different directions. If I cut the board across here, then generally the rings are going across the board, and so the board is going to expand and contract this way here. But here, the rings are going with the board, and so the board is going to expand and contract this way here. And what that does is if I cut this board out and let it dry, it's going to want to cup. And rings always want to straighten out. So if I have the rings going around this way, when I cut it, the board is going to want to bend this way, and it's going to want to cup that way. And so all of these flat sawn boards are going to come out of here, and they're going to want to cup. All those rings are going to want to straighten out. There are other types of cuts here. You can do quarter sawn cuts, and these ones, almost all of the rings are going across the board, and that's why quarter sawn is an incredibly stable wood, because this board wants to expand and contract this way. It doesn't want to expand and contract this way very much. So the board isn't going to get that much wider. It's going to get a little bit wider, but it's not going to get as much as if it's going this way. If you've got a board like this where most of the rings are going around the board, and so you have them going like this, the board is going to want to expand and contract this way far more than expanding and contracting this way. So you have to think about where the grains are going. But then you also have, these are fully quarter sawn boards, so the rings are going across these almost perfectly. Then these over here are actually riven wood, and these are the absolute best wood you can get because every board, when it's riven, is in line with the core, so all of the grain is going across it. So these are the most stable cuts. But that also means you're going to get the most waste because you have all these wedges left over that aren't getting used. So you have to think about the rings on the wood and what those are actually going to be doing to it. Because in most boards, here I was looking through my stock and I didn't have many that cupped. But this one, let me see if I can do this. No, you're not going to see it that way. I'll do it this way. This one has a cup to the board. Not very much, but about what you normally expect. You can see how it dips down in. And what's happening here, let me grab a marker so you can actually see this a little better. That and a straight edge. So, cap. If I put the straight edge on here, you can see that there's like a little bit more than 1/16 of an inch in here where it has the gap. And the rings on this go like this. And so you can see how the rings are trying to straighten out. And if the rings are shaped like that, the board is going to cup up, and you're going to get the gap on the top here and the bulge on the bottom here. The rings are trying to straighten out.
So is that the battle of the bulge?
Yes, that is a very good one. I like that. The other way that wood movement ends up coming is it looks like a good twist. And this is one of my favorite twisted boards. This is a piece of holly that I was given a long time ago. But this board, you can look down at, and this thing is just, it's a corkscrew. I absolutely love this piece. And that is wood movement due to actual twist in the grain. So when this was cut, it was flat, but the tree that it was cut out of was bent and twisted by the wind or its own weight. And then once it relaxes, that pressure comes out. And that is a wood movement that happens once. It's the release of the pressure. So if you cut wood from a limb, it's going to be hanging out there, and all of the limb is trying to pull itself back up. But then you cut that limb and you put it down on the ground. Now it still has all that force trying to pull it back into place, so you might get a board that will cup this way, end to end. And that's because the pressure is being released from the board. Any questions before I head on farther? Turn my sound off.
We had, I know, one before and another one's come in. Are you ready?
Are they along lines or?
I mean, they talk about wood movement.
Cool.
I never know, like...
No, I'll answer one before I jump back into the next step.
Okay, so Poorman asks, after stabilizing a piece of wood, are there any circumstances in which you would need to worry about wood movement, and if so, what degree compared to non-stabilized wood?
Okay, stabilization, we're going to touch on that in a little bit, and so I'll answer that when we get to there. But basically, there are there's three factors that can cause wood movement. One of them is tension inside the wood, from that limb that's hanging out, and you take it down, you cut it, or the tree that has been leaning for all of these years, and you take it down, you cut it, and that tree wants to stand back up. And so you do have that tension, but that's a one-time movement. The regular movement that people are thinking about is this expansion and contraction of the wood that happens seasonally. Part of that can happen due to heat. Wood will expand and contract as you heat it up. If you add heat, it will expand. If you cool it down, it will shrink, which will confuse a lot of Windsor chair makers out there, and I'll explain that in a minute. The other form of movement, which is far, far more important, is water absorption. If you get water into the wood will expand. If you take water out of the wood, it will contract. And so that's why in the summer, if you have something with breadboard ends, when it's hot and humid, at least around here, our summers are the most humid time of the year. In some places it's different. But the most humid time of the year, all the wood starts to absorb moisture, and it starts to expand and contract. It starts to expand, not contract. It expands and expands and expands until it reaches equilibrium with the air and the amount of moisture in the air. And that's what kind of confuses some people, is that with the heat going into the air, the wood is also expanding. But in Windsor chair makers, what they'll do is they'll put a piece of wood into the kiln, and they will heat it up a lot, and that will cause the wood to shrink. Well, it's not the heat that's causing the wood to shrink. It's that you're heating up all the water inside of the wood, and it's evaporating and getting out of the wood. And as that water leaves the wood, then the wood will shrink. And then you can put it into the socket of the Windsor chair, and it will absorb moisture and expand. And once it's inside that socket, it'll expand and lock itself in place, because now the wood has reached a new equilibrium, which makes it bigger. So you have to think about furniture. Is it going to be going through that heat cool? Is it going to be going through the high moisture, low moisture, expansion, contraction? Now, in a house, there isn't that much expansion and contraction with air conditioning going on, because your humidity level is far more in control. If you're in a house without air conditioning, then there's a lot more expansion and contraction, and you might get a decent amount of change throughout the year. If it is wood that goes outside and is in the rain, you're going to get a lot of expansion and contraction, because there's a lot of moisture to be absorbed. And then the sun comes out and bakes off all that moisture, and it shrinks back down. And so you've got a constant fight against that. Now, what you can do is you can stabilize the wood. The reason that it expands and contracts is there are all these pores. There are holes going through the wood in all different directions. And air gets into the board, and it either takes moisture out or it brings moisture with it. And if the air can get inside, then it can expand and contract. What you can do is actually stabilize the board, which more or less fills the board with epoxy or a polymer that stops the air from getting in and out. You can do this a couple different ways. You can do it with a penetrating epoxy that creates a barrier all the way around the outside, or you can do a vacuum stabilization, which I have an entire video on that, where you can put a piece of wood into a vacuum, suck all the air out of it, have that piece of wood submerged in a polymer solution, so when you force the air back in, it forces all that polymer solution into the wood. And then you can bake it and actually basically turn the wood into plastic. And at that point, moisture can't get in, so the board doesn't expand and contract from moisture. It only will expand and contract from heat, which isn't very much in comparison to what it can do from moisture. So back to the rule, if you do a good stabilization, expansion and contraction really isn't something you have to think about, because then it's expanding and contracting like it does with most other things. Wood will expand and contract about the same rate as epoxy from just heat. So if you have an epoxy inlaid table, as long as there isn't any moisture transfer, the wood will actually expand and contract at about the same rate as the epoxy does, which isn't much at all. And so that's one of those crazy things you have to wrap your brain around. If you actually get the wood stabilized, it doesn't expand and contract that much. What was his question particularly?
After stabilizing a piece of wood, are there any circumstances in which you would need to worry about wood movement? If so, what degree compared to non-stabilized wood?
So basically, no. If the wood is stabilized and stabilized well, it's very rare you have to think about wood movement, because the wood movement may end up being like a 1/16 of an inch over 8 feet, which is not that much movement. It is a very, very small amount. Whereas if you take something like oak, oak may have an expansion and contraction of a 1/16 inch over 8 inches. And if you do a full absorption of moisture to a completely dry, you may have a full 1/8 of an inch movement over about a foot or so. It's a wild amount of movement. And so if you start thinking about a table that is 3 foot across, so now you're at 3 foot, so you might have 3/8 of an inch of movement from full absorption to completely dry. Now, regular humidity in the air is probably only going to make that 3 foot table expand and contract about 1/8 of an inch or so. Outside in the rain, you might get a 1/4 inch or so of expansion and contraction, but you're still going to be getting a lot of expansion and contraction across the board. Ooh, across the board, that's a good way to put it. Any questions when I set up the next step? Listen to this.
Yeah, but I have a question.
What's that?
So, does wood movement produce a different type of stool sample?
Ooh. That came from the nurse, folks.
Sorry.
So let's assume all of our wood is flat sawn. So it's just taking the board and slicing it down. And with flat sawn, you're going to get the boards that want to cup. But you can generally envision that the wood is going to move across the board, and it's going to move horizontal. It's going to move this way a little bit. So generally, most of the time when you're looking at a board, you have to be worried about the board expanding and contracting this way. It will expand and contract this way a little bit, but usually not enough you have to worry about. And you don't even have to think about it expanding and contracting lengthwise. Length is generally not going to change on the board. So saying all that, you have to keep that in mind for joinery. So if I'm going to take 2 boards and I'm going to join them together, let me actually set this up here. I'm going to join these 2 boards together like this. And I'm going to use dovetails. Well, the nice thing about this is both boards, let me back this up a little bit, drop them on the floor, make a big mess of life.
That wouldn't be any cheap.
Life is the same. Let me grab a smaller board so I can do this better. Let's grab that one and this mess of a board. This one is my stop board from cutting all of my coins. If you buy anything from my store, you actually get Wood by Wright coins. So if I join together 2 boards like this, I would put dovetails into it. And the nice thing about it is both of these boards are going to want to expand and contract this way. And because they're joined in together in a finger joint manner, they're both going to expand and contract together at roughly the same rate. So I don't have to worry about expansion and contraction. They're both going to expand and contract up. Now, they're both going to want to expand and contract this way, but not enough for me to worry about. So I don't even think about the expansion and contraction this way. I'm thinking about the expansion and contraction this way. And in this manner, there really isn't too much of a problem there. Now, if I were to take this board and I were to join it in here, then I might have to think about a little bit of expansion and contraction, because this board is going to want to expand and contract this way when it sockets in there. But this board is not going to expand and contract this way with it. So as this goes into it, this board, if it expands, is going to want to crush into the fibers. If it contracts, it might create a little gap. But this board is only about 2.5 inches wide. The expansion and contraction of this board is relatively small and generally not something I would even think about socking into like that. But what would happen if I were to make it into a full table width, and now I want to put on a breadboard end? Now I have to be worried about it, because this whole table segment, this will want to expand and contract this way, but this breadboard end won't expand and contract. And so one of the problems that people will have is they'll have their breadboard end.
Okay.
And what's that?
Did you explain what a breadboard end is?
It's whenever you have a board on the end of a table and then all of your other boards butt into it.
Ah.
That's a breadboard end. What this will do is it will keep this whole, all of these planks will want to twist and warp. This will lock them all together so they won't twist and warp.
Okay. I didn't know if you had said that. Sorry.
Oh, good for stopping me. That's what we're here for. The problem is when people see a breadboard end, they think it's an artistic thing. It's nice to have long grain on the end of the board rather than seeing all the end grain of the wood. The problem comes when you try to connect these boards in. If you connect them all in rigidly with something that doesn't move, now you're having a problem, because this whole tabletop is wanting to expand and contract against this end grain, and the end is against the length of this board. And this board isn't going to expand and contract with it, so you may actually end up shearing off or breaking your joinery as it goes into it. So a traditional breadboard end will have one board in the middle that is tightly affixed, and the other boards are actually floating, so they can move in a slot. So you're only actually affixing it at the middle, and the other two sides of the table can expand and contract. You're keeping that movement in mind so that, knowing the boards are going to expand, you're going to give a slot for the board to move in. And that's where a lot of traditional joinery really works well, because it used to be that no house had air conditioning. Almost every house was open to the air, and so whatever the moisture level was outside, it was inside. And so you kind of had to treat all furniture as if it were outdoor furniture. And a lot of traditional joinery is built around this idea of wood movement and not allowing boards to be captured in a way that they will cause problems. And that has kind of come into the psyche of all woodworkers, that you have to make your joinery perfect so that it's not going to run into problem with wood movement. But the problem is, most furniture that's made nowadays is made to go into an air-conditioned house, where it's probably not going to run into that much air movement. And I've done several spots where I've put boards together in what would be improper, but the amount of wood movement they're going to see in an air-conditioned house is not going to cause them any problem. Now, I'm going to have to think about that if I ever want to take them into a house that's not air-conditioned, but I'm never going to live in a house that's not air-conditioned. So I don't have to worry about that. So let's actually move on to a couple other connection methods. So the breadboard end is the most common whenever you're working with a tabletop, because the wider your board is, the more expansion and contraction it's going to want to occur, the more you're going to see in it. You're working with small boards that are 2 inches, 3 inches wide. Yeah, they're going to expand and contract a little bit, but generally you have to pull out calipers and see 1/1000th of an inch once a year, and wood compresses. And that's one of the things that you have to kind of think about, is that yes, if you do put a joint in there and it does expand, the wood around it will compress. The wood that's inside will compress, and it will take up a little bit of that force. And that's where Windsor chair joints really come into their own, is that you shrink them down, put them into a tight hole, and then let them expand in place. Are they going to bust things apart? No, they're small enough that they don't have that much pressure in the joint, but they're going to compress in the joint and you're going to get something that's tighter. You're actually allowing the wood movement to work for you. Think through 24. Any questions yet?
There are a couple.
Okay, what do we got before I jump on the next set?
Let's see. Bryan Fulmer asks, how much do you worry about metal or rock interfering with wood movement? And then parentheses, thinking of the table with the rock insert.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that you have to start thinking about other things being around. Now, usually, if the board is less than a foot wide, I generally don't even take wood movement into consideration unless it's an outdoor project. If it's an outdoor project, wood movement is something I have to take into consideration, like 2 inches wide and wider. But for indoors, if it's less than a foot wide, I don't even think about wood movement. That's my personal preference because I'm making things for an air-conditioned building. But if I were to put a rock into a board that is 3 foot wide, it depends on where I'm going to put it. If I'm going to put it in the middle of the board, well, then I'm only going to have to worry about the area that's actually touching it. And so if it's a 1 foot wide rock in the middle of a 3 foot wide board, well, the middle of the board is only going to move in that 1 foot area. So generally I'm not going to have to worry about it. But if I'm putting a 4 foot wide rock into the middle of a 4 foot wide board, then I'm going to have to think about it because the board is going to want to expand and contract. And I have to then think about what time of the year am I putting it in here. There are times where I'm actually going to create tenons. If I'm building them in the winter, I'm going to build them a little bit sloppy so that during the summer they can expand and fill in. Sometimes I might make them tight just so that they get that Windsor chair expansion, but I want to think through the time of the year I'm putting into. If I'm worried about wood movement in a particular area, if it's in the summer, I'm going to realize the board is about as big as it's going to get. So I want to make it nice and tight. So when the winter comes and the board starts to shrink, it's not going to make it too gappy and sloppy in there. So you have to think about the time of the year that things come into it. But then you start thinking about metal. And metal frames and things like that in wood are where you really run into problems. I have a sign for Camp Joy up in Wisconsin that I made a while ago. And it's 8 foot by 4 foot. And it's treated lumber. And I glued all these panels together. So it's 4 foot of inch and a half treated lumber. Well, on the back there are these steel straps holding it together so that the boards don't warp and twist, and all of these are bolted vertically onto the back. The problem is that I now have 4 foot of expansion and contraction in pine in an outdoor application, and that's going to create a lot of expansion and contraction. I could see possibly as much as 3/4 inch over the full board. And that is something you have to take into consideration. In my case, I ended up making the screws going through the steel. I created little slots so they could expand and contract. And in this case, I actually underestimated it. And now, if you go there at the right time of the year in the winter, you'll see a crack running right through the middle of the board about 1/8 of an inch, where the middle boards have separated. And so there's an 1/8 inch crack going through there driving me nuts because I didn't leave enough separation in there. And so those are things you have to think through. Thankfully, it's on a big road sign and you really can't see it unless you walk up to it and look for it. But it's annoying for people who know what they're looking for. Live and learn. So yeah, if you're thinking about steel doesn't expand and contract. It's that breadboard situation you have to think about at the boards coming into it. Are you going to leave enough slop so that they can move on you? And then that comes into epoxy, which is every YouTuber's favorite additive to wood. The table upstairs where I have epoxy lakes, I had to really think through that because if I am going to have this in any place where it's going to get, where I'm going to get a large amount of water absorption on it, that can be a problem because the wood around it can absorb moisture and cause it to break free from the epoxy. In our case, it's not a problem. If kids spill water on it, there isn't going to be enough expansion and contraction from that unless I, leave a 5-gallon bucket's worth of water on top of the table overnight, in which case that'd be my own fault. And so those are one of the things I kind of had to balance. Is it worth doing that and having this really cool epoxy inlay with the risk that, yeah, it might if there is some catastrophic problem with water. And so that's some of the things I have to think about. But I'm willing to do that because the reward is well worth it. If I was going to be making this and selling it to someone else, I would be having a very serious conversation with them about it, because I don't want them to just think that the table is waterproof and one day decide to take it outside for a picnic. Carry a 500-pound table outside for a picnic. But that's one of the things I would have to talk through with the client and say, I really wouldn't want this in a high moisture environment. Is your house air conditioned all year round, or do you only turn air conditioning on for a month out of the year, or what are your current conditions? So you have to kind of think through all of that. But all of this being said, people really start to get scared about, I don't know, I just built this thing, is it going to explode on me? And wood movement doesn't happen like that. Wood movement is a very, very slow thing. Right? For most things, we're talking a 1/16 inch of movement over the course of 6 months. And the amount of pressure behind it isn't enough to cause absolute catastrophic failure at some time, like all of a sudden, bam, my dining room table fell apart. It's one of these things that just kind of slowly creeps up over the years. Sorry, I just got something in my eye. And most teachers out there really teach wood movement a lot. And they put a lot of emphasis on correct joinery so that your table doesn't explode. And that really just ends up causing a lot of fear in the woodworker. And then the problem is that woodworker then goes on and teach someone else and instills that fear into the next person. And usually it's going to be a little bit more, because it's better to overestimate the problem than underestimate it. And so this fear kind of grows from generation to generation of woodworker. And I'm here to tell you, relax. It's okay. Everything's fine. Yes, wood moves, but 99% of the time it's not going to be an issue.
No.
So if you're really worried about it, just relax.
Nope. It's the year 2020. September, exploding tables.
Truth. I shouldn't say those things anymore.
Just saying.
So yeah, you will be able to get away with a lot of cross grain connections if you use proper joinery. But one of the things about using improper joinery is a lot of times you're just slapping things together with screws. And screws are actually a great way to allow wood movement. In particular, if you have that tabletop, so you have that wide tabletop, and you've got a skirt running around it. So you've got these vertical boards running all the way around the table. Well, how exactly do you mount that tabletop down? If you put anything through it, you're going to cause problems for the skirt that's going across the board. And as that board wants to expand and contract, there really isn't a way of holding it down. And one of the historical methods, and when I mean historical methods, I mean like 1600s historical methods for attaching a top down to a skirt, is with pocket holes. And these things that people think are totally improper joinery, pocket holes. They do great for wood movement. They allow the wood to expand and contract because they're a loose hole, and so that screw over time can move inside of the hole, and it can allow that top to expand and contract. So screws can be a great way to get around wood movement because they're not a solid connection where you're literally gluing the fibers together. You have a screw in there that can move around in the joint. Now you have to keep in mind that over time those screws will want to work loose, and so you might need to tighten them up, and every now and then you might strip them out, in which case you can fill the hole and re-put the screw in. But they are a very good, viable way of connecting boards together and allowing wood movement. So don't diss the pocket hole. What other questions we got?
We're talking about exploding tables now. Let's see. Harold Golden had asked, when you edge glue several boards together, do you alternate the growth ring pattern?
Ah, yes. So here's the idea. So if I were to glue, let me flip these around. If I were to glue these three boards together, and one of them has the cup up, and this one has the cup down, and this one has the cup up, should I alternate that pattern so that I have a smiley face and a frowny face and a smiley face? If the wood is dry, no. If the wood is dry, and it's been kiln dried, air dried, and it's good to go, it's generally not going to cause a problem whether it's up or down. You will have a whole series of teachers out there who will tell you, yes, you must alternate them so that if there's any problem and any expansion contract, you get a wavy top. And then you'll have other teachers who say, no, you should always have the cup facing up so that when they dry, they'll want to arc down, and that way any fasteners can hold them in place. And so you always want to have the cup up on every board. And honestly, it really doesn't matter. Whenever, if you're putting decking down, decking on a deck, you always put the cup, you always put the cup up, not the cup down. Why was I saying that? So if the board is cupped like this, I gotta think through that again. If you want the cup of the board, so you want the board to be cupped this way on the bench, so when you put screws in, you can suck that cup out, or you put the screw in to stop the cup from forming. And the way you do that is you have the cup of the growth rings facing up. So if you look at the growth rings on the board, they should create a smiley face so that when the board warps, it will want to warp up, and it will fight against the screws that are holding it down in place. And it's the same idea with a tabletop, is if you are going to be doing it outside, you want to have the smiley face on the board so that any hardware is holding it down. So as the table will want to naturally
Okay, so you had
arch
that
up
board where you drew the grain on the end.
Where is that? This one?
Yeah.
This one, yes. So what you would have is on a tabletop, this board wants to cup this way. So right now we have the frowny face. If you have a smiley face on there, now you can see the board is wanting to cup this way. And the nice thing about that is if you have fasteners holding this down before it cups, then you have that cupping will be fighting against the fastener, and the fastener will be stopping that cup from happening. Whereas if you flip it around this way and you put in a fastener here, then nothing's going to be fighting against it, and it's going to naturally cup up. There's nothing holding this down. And then the whole school comes into, well, what happens if you put a screw here and a screw here? Now you have it holding down, and it really comes into, how big is your board? But for deck work, smiley face. Sorry, I started using the cup terminology because the board cups, but then you also have the smiley face or the frowny face, which is often referred to as the cup of the grain. So you want the cup down or do you want the cup up?
So just turn that frown upside down is the mantra.
Yes. But when it comes to a tabletop, indoors, really doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. I usually look at the board, and whichever side is prettier, that's the side I put up. But often I do spend more and I get quarter sawn wood, because quarter sawn wood is not going to expand and contract as much as flat sawn wood, because the growth rings are going across. So the mass of the main expansion and contraction force is across the board, across the thickness of the board rather than across the width of the board. And so quarter sawn wood is far more stable. Quarter sawn wood doesn't expand and contract. Quarter sawn wood doesn't cup. If the tree was any good, quarter sawn wood doesn't twist. It's one of these things that it's really stable and really nice. So if you're working with wood and you're really worried about expansion and contraction, get quarter sawn wood. And if you don't actually have a place that sells quarter sawn wood, well, then go and look at the end grain and make sure that the rings are going across the board rather than making a cup shape. If the more the grain is going across the board, the closer it is to quarter sawn, the more stable the board is. And that's why a lot of states actually still have laws on the book for how to make ladder rungs. Ladder rails must be made out of quarter sawn wood, and then the ladder rungs must be made out of riven wood, and that way you can make sure you have the grain running all the way through the rung of the ladder. And so it's actually in law in several states. Not that anyone really makes wooden ladders to be sold anymore. Yeah. What's the next question? Or do we have any?
We have questions. Let's see. Bill Tiffin asked, how small would a box have to be before you wouldn't worry about wood movement?
Well, part of that depends on what will the box be used in. If it's going to be sitting on top of a dresser, basically if the box has all its dimensions are less than a foot, I don't worry about wood movement. I actually did a box not too long ago where I had 4 dovetailed sides, and I had a bottom plate that was bigger than the box, and I actually recessed that whole box down into the bottom plate. So all 4 sides were constrained into the bottom. And it looks great. I love the fit. It's a really, really sharp look. But then people started asking, well, what about that bottom? That bottom is going to want to expand and contract, and that's going to cause problems trying to push these sidewalls off of the box. And the box was only about a foot wide. And I didn't stabilize that one. That was only about a foot wide, and it was going to be in an air-conditioned house. It was actually for a church, so it's going to be staying in a dry storage room. And so it's one of those things like, yeah, I may end up getting a 64th of an inch wood movement, maybe. And that 64th of an inch wood movement is well within the compression capability of the wood. So it's something I'm not really going to think about. Now, if I were to make that for, say, a woodworking chest, I wouldn't recess it into the bottom because I'd have about 2.5 feet. And then you might start getting, 32nd to a 16th of an inch movement. And 16th of an inch of movement might actually push the dovetails off. And so that's one of those things where I probably wouldn't use it on that big of a box. Especially if that box was ever sitting on concrete. And that's another thing to think about, is if you ever take a board and you set it flat on concrete and you come back a couple days later, that board is going to cup up. And you're going to have this board that is bent up away from the concrete with the round portion down. And what happened is the bottom of that board is sucking moisture out of the concrete, and it's actually absorbing all the moisture into the bottom of the board and not the top of the board. So the top of the board is staying stagnant. The bottom of the board is expanding, causing that board to cup up. And the way you fix it is you take the board and you move it away from the concrete and you let it sit. And then it will release that moisture it had, and the board will go back to flat. That's why we put stickers between our boards. So if you're ever stacking up all your lumber, put boards in between so you can get air movement through the stack. That way you get an even absorption and repulsion. It takes on and loses moisture evenly all the way around the board because air can get to all sides. So yeah, I probably get that question about once every 2 to 3 months of, I just milled up all these lumber and I set them down and I came back the next day and the board on the bottom's all twisted. What do I do? So just set it aside and let it go back to equilibrium. Don't store wood on concrete. That it causes all sorts of problems. And there was another one. A guy had a lumber rack by his wash sink, and it was constantly getting splashed. And so the boards next to the wash sink were warping, and the ones away from it were fine. So think about that as well.
Mind the splash zone.
Yeah. What other questions we got?
Let's see. Tom West wants to know, does BLO affect wood movement?
Yeah, okay, that's another interesting thing, is you can actually, if you get an oil absorbing into the wood, the oil will actually cause wood movement because it's absorbing into the wood and will cause the wood to absorb, will cause the wood to expand as it takes on the oil. And so that's one of the reasons why you finish all the way around a board. You don't just finish one side because the finish itself will cause a little bit of expansion and contraction. But also, now that you've finished one side, air has a harder time getting in that side, but it has a much easier time getting in the other side. So the other side will expand and contract much faster than the side that's finished. And so you'll get a board that will cup constantly because one side is finished and the other side isn't. I've had several times where I've gotten an old saw handle or plane tote and it is completely dry and almost flaky. I will actually take that and I'll put it in a Ziploc bag filled with boiled linseed oil, and let it absorb as much as it possibly can. Then take it off and let it dry and polymerize and polish it down. And all the wood fibers then expand, and any micro cracks are suddenly filled back in. And it'll actually cause the wood to expand back to its original size. So, yes, adding oil will cause the wood to expand and contract. And just like with water, the more you add, the more it expands. And then it also stops it. And that's one of the reasons why finishes, you want to, well, number one, you want to make sure you do it all the way around, but different finishes stop different amounts of air movement. If I'm just going to be using boiled linseed oil and paste wax, it really doesn't stop that much air movement. That's why I generally don't use boiled linseed oil and paste wax for exterior conditions. It just isn't going to stop anything. If it were on like a tabletop or something like that, it's where I'm usually going to be using a poly or a hard wax, because it will stop the water from getting into the wood. And so you can actually stop those micro expansion contractions from water being dumped on the surface. So, yeah. What other questions we got?
Well, we have a super chat from Mr. West.
Ah, Tom, how's it going? BLO, boards like oils, yes.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
You want to hear a fishing joke?
Why would I want to do that?
Just for the halibut.
I almost didn't give you that one.
I know, I was hoping. I was fishing. I was like, give it to me. Sorry, we heard that joke this week and it was really funny.
Yes. Thank you, Tom.
Yes, thank you. Hope that was satisfactory for your mom joke.
Yeah, just before we actually close out, I'm going to go back and talk through the original wood movement now that we're towards the end, and for people who hopped on. So I'll be going back over some of those beginning things I talked about.
Okay,
in a moment.
I have 4 questions at the moment.
Okay, let's do those 4, and then I'll jump into this.
Let's see.
Oh, got dust in my eye. It's driving me bonkers.
Let's see. Harold Golden asks, James, do you acclimate your lumber, and if so, for how long?
Yes. Whenever I buy lumber somewhere else, I bring it in the shop and I let it sit. If that lumber has been outside, like if I brought it from Matt Cremona, it's probably like 2 inches thick. I'm probably going to leave it in the shop for 2 or 3 months before I touch it. If I buy it from a lumber yard and it's been inside, it's kiln dried, I'm probably going to bring it in here and let it acclimate for a couple weeks. But I'm always going to let the wood acclimate. And so I've done a couple videos on how do you test for is lumber dry, and that will give you a good idea of when it is, because you are actually either drying the wood or adding moisture. So if you're in a garage shop with a high moisture content and you buy it from a wood store with a low moisture content, you're going to actually wait for the wood to absorb moisture. So you want to actually watch that reading going up rather than it going down, because I'm in a dry basement, so I'm almost always waiting for that number to go down. So it really depends on type of wood, thickness of wood, where it came from, the type of shop it's going into. You really can't throw a rule of thumb at that. But yeah, the longer you can wait, the better. And also, if you are going to be milling up your lumber, cutting it to size, if you're going to take it to your exact final dimension, do that the same day you do your joinery. Or the next thing, if you do your joinery and you get that butter perfect joint, you may want to think about actually doing the final glue up that day. Otherwise, you come back another day, especially if you're in a garage and expansion and contraction happens, the board's going to be a slightly different dimension than it was before. So, just something to think about. What's next?
Sorry, I had a thing go through my head that made me chuckle. It was how much wood would a wood shop shop if a wood shop could shop wood. Sorry. These are the thoughts that go through my mind.
That's why I married her.
Tom West, what did you want to know? What happens in traditional barns with the wooden pegs driven throughout the timbers tightly? How come they do not break and crack and check?
Yes. Well, number one is you're talking like a 3/4 inch or a 1 inch peg. yes, that 1-inch peg is going to expand and contract a little bit, but generally not enough to cause any problem. There are some traditional timber framers who would actually take those pegs and dry them out in a kiln before driving them in so that they would then expand. But most of the time, they're made out of the same timbers that they're being driven into. And so that timber is going to shrink and expand at the same rate that that peg will shrink and expand. And so the two of them then shrink and expand together. And so that's usually not a problem because of that. What's next?
Okay, hang on.
Oh, unless you're thinking about, the peg is a foot long going through a foot long beam. Well, the beam will expand and contract and just move on that peg. And so it allows it to slide. So it is a mechanical joint as opposed to a fixed joint in that case.
All right, Bryan Fulmer, what do you want to know? Since you mentioned failure point, what joint/piece would explode in a normal piece of a furniture build?
No finish explodes. No furniture explodes. The worst possible cases is you'll see either a breadboard end that has been attached all the way along the joint, and then you'll see that the tenons or whatever has been attached is sheared off, or you'll see breaking in the breadboard itself. The other common one is if you put a back on a dresser or a cabinet. If it's a solid wood piece, that whole back will want to expand and contract. So if you have a 4-foot by 5-foot dresser and you have a 4-foot by 5-foot piece of wood on the back, that whole back is going to want to expand and contract, and either it's going to bubble out or it's going to start forcing joinery apart. And so that's why most of the time for backs they put shiplap on there, and so you'd have 4-inch slats of wood, and each of those 4 inches could expand and contract with a little bit of a joint in between them. And that's one of the reasons why wood floors don't have a huge amount of problem, is you're not thinking about my 8-foot wide room, all the floor expanding and contracting. You have all of these boards, and the smaller those boards are, each board is going to expand and contract just a tiny, tiny bit. Whereas if you have big slats, 6-inch or 8-inch floor slats, those 6-inch, 8-inch floor slats will want to expand and contract, and you'll end up getting bigger gaps due to those bigger rails. A lot of old wood floors only have like 1.5 or 2-inch wooden slats, and those give you much less expansion and contraction, so you have less problems with cracks over the years. What's next?
Let's see. Sir Knight said, "Hi James, I recently watched a Matt Cremona video on the subject of wood drying, and he recommended having a dehumidifier with it to suck up all the releasing moisture. What are your thoughts on this?"
Yes, yeah. Whatever Matt says, he is the man when it comes to that. But yeah, that's the way almost all kilns work, is they will raise the temperature, but that alone is not enough. You need to have a dehumidifier to actually suck moisture out of the air. Otherwise, you're just going to get a hot, humid room, and a hot, humid room just keeps the moisture there for the wood to reabsorb. So if you're actually drying the wood, having a dehumidifier is almost necessary. The way you do it without that is you have a lot of air movement. And so traditionally you would air dry, and so you would keep them in a space that would be dry from the elements and would heat up. And so you heat up the air inside, you let the air move through it, and that removes the moisture, the moist hot air out, and then it's replaced with new hot air. And that can then take out more moisture. But you can do that with just putting a dehumidifier in the kiln and doing it that way. What's next?
Let's see. Bill Gilchrist asked, "I'm building a hose rack out of a Cadd that has a 4x4. I need to put in the ground. What should be put on the post in the ground?"
Oh, to protect the post. Well, I would do a treated lumber and seat it in concrete if possible. But if you can't do that, then put a penetrating epoxy onto the wood, and that will help protect it from anything in there. But it has more to do with the type of wood you're putting into the ground than what you put on it. So treated lumber, great. White oak, really good. Cedar, really good. Pine, bad. And every wood is going to have a different durability to the ground. So, hope that answers your question. How many questions? You say you just got a few.
I have 2 more to go.
All right, let's do those then.
Let's see. Adam Nestor asked, when would mixing woods cause an issue?
Different woods are going to have different expansion contraction rates. So you need to think through that. But usually the expansion contraction rate is pretty closely connected to the density of the wood. The more dense, the heavier the wood is, the less it's going to expand and contract. Basically, it has less space to take in moisture, so it's not going to be able to expand much. But if you get a very light, porous wood, it's going to be able to expand much, much more. A few caveats to that is like oak. Oak and maple are relatively close in density, but oak has far more pores, and therefore it can get air farther into the wood, so the oak will expand and contract a little bit faster than the maple will. But as long as you're matching woods of equal density, generally not going to be a problem. If you're trying to put together, say, pine and maple, you're going to have to think about some wood movement. You don't want those running into each other that much. But for the most part, it's not something I think about that much. Because usually if you're mixing lumber, you're working on something a little smaller. What's the next one?
So His Mercy 44 asked, what's the best way to start milling a log by hand? Resaw from the edge or split first and then resaw out a board?
All depends on what you have and what time you want to put into it. Using the saw will give you the most lumber out of the stock. If you rive it and split it, you're going to end up losing a lot of material, but you're going to get better lumber out of it. If you rive the lumber, you're going to get more stable wood because you're following the grain of the wood. If you cut it, you'll end up cutting through several fibers, and you'll get wood that's a little less strong. But 90% of the lumber out there was all cut, so it's not going to cause that much of an issue for most things. So it really depends on how much you want to get into it. Splitting the wood is usually a little bit more work, but not always. So kind of think through the process in that. Was that a...
Tom's got another super chat for us. Support wood movement, support wood by Wright. What else do you plan on doing on Wednesday nights, really? Patreon this channel.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, and if you are a patron or a member on either of the channels, go look at the feed. There's something special happening today that you have access to that no one else does until tomorrow. So thank you to all the patrons and members. You got 3 minutes left. Cool. I'm going to go through this wood movement one more time. What's that?
My mom joke.
Oh, mom joke. Yep. I'll set this up while you're doing that.
I heard diarrhea is hereditary. It runs in your genes.
Ooh.
I figured I had to tie that into the wood
one.
movement.
So I want to go through the log one more time for those of you who joined and weren't on earlier. If you think about the log wood movement, how does the wood actually expand and contract? It doesn't expand and contract in all ways. The log itself does not get longer and does not get shorter. The length of the board is the length of the board. The board isn't going to expand and contract. And generally, the log itself is not going to get much bigger across the log. It will get bigger and smaller a little bit, but not as much as it will radially. And that's why, oops, wrong one. That's why you get cracks in wood. So we hear a crack coming out here, and that is because it's expanding and contracting on those rays. So each one of those rings is getting bigger if it takes on moisture, or is getting smaller if it gets rid of moisture. And so as this whole log has dried, each of those rings will be getting rid of moisture. So if the ring here in the middle, if I come out 1 inch, that's going to give me a radius of 3.14 inches. And so I'm going to have 3.14 inches worth of wood movement. And over that 3.14 inches, it's well within the expansion and contraction compressibility of the fibers. But if I come all the way out here, I've got about a 10-inch wide log. And so that's about 3 foot in diameter. So that 3 foot diameter is going to expand and contract a lot more. And so that's why I have a bigger crack out here, about 3/8 of an inch. So this board has shrunk by 3/8 of an inch around its radial pattern. And so if you come through here and you cut these boards out of it, as this board comes through here, here in the middle, it's not going to expand and contract that much this way, but it is going to expand and contract a lot more out here on the edge because you have this ring going through the board. So if I grab this one over here, you can see how this board will want to expand and contract this way along the ring, and it will want to expand and contract this way here in the middle. But here, it's not going to expand and contract this way much at all. And so that's what causes cupping, is that these rings are trying to straighten out. These rings are trying to get longer, or are trying to get shorter. So as this board dries out, this outside long ring will try to shrink much, much faster than this smaller inside ring. And so that will cause this board to cup. So rings are always trying to straighten out. And that's what causes boards to cup and bow. But that being said, here is a twisted board. This is a piece of holly, and this is actually caused by tension in the wood. So what happens is this probably came out of a limb that had been twisted from some reason. And when it was cut and milled, it could then release all that pressure. And you now have this twisted board as it slowly releases its pressure over time. That's what also will cause a board to bind up on a table saw, is if it has pressure in there. So if you're ever cutting a limb, getting lumber out of a limb, that limb, when it gets put down and it allows that pressure to come out, will want to straighten back out because it's spent all these years trying to pull itself back up. It's put a lot of tension into the board. Same thing if you have a tree that's been blowing in the wind and it's always had all this tension trying to fight against the wind or fight against a lot of weight on one side or the other. When you cut it, it's going to want to release that pressure out. And so those are the types of movements and what actually causes it. Once you understand where the movement comes from, everything else makes a lot more sense. So yeah, this has been kind of fun. Any questions before we wrap up?
We have one last one sneak in.
One more, cool. One big one.
Does sealing the end grain on a log also seal in moisture and maybe promote spalting?
Won't promote spalting. I'll touch on that. But basically, when you're drying wood, because you have all of these open pores on the log, all these open pores on the ends of the board, air can come and go from the end of the board much faster than it can come and go out of the sides of the board. And this will cause the ends of the boards to dry much faster. So you'll get all of this cracking and checking here as these ends dry and shrink faster than the inside of the board will. And so what you can do is stop that by sealing the ends, and that will slow down the moisture absorption to be very, very similar to what it gets coming through the outside of the log. And so that's why if you're drying the lumber, you're going to want to paint latex paint or anchor seal or something of that nature on these to stop the ends from getting rid of moisture, or at least slow them down so they're not getting it quite as much as the outside. If you want spalting on a log, what you're going to do is cut the log, don't put anything on the ends, and stand it up on the dirt. And what spalting is when fungus gets up into the log. And this will allow the fungus to reach the bottom of the log and will get up into it. You're going to end up losing an inch or so on the bottom where it just gets rotten. You'll have to cut that off. But that spalting will work its way up through the pores. And if you can, lay it down and put dirt piled up on both ends, and you'll get spalting coming in from both sides, and maybe some working up from the middle. But spalting is actually when you allow fungus to get into the wood. So it's actually a little bit of rot that you like because it looks cool. Cool. Well, this has been a fun one. I hope you guys have had as much fun as I have. If you have any other ideas for live sessions, let me know. We may be doing a few of those lives with Sarah when we start doing the bench. I'm not sure when we'll start that, but it will be sometime.
We gotta get the wood.
Yeah, we're gonna do the whole build. Sarah's gonna do the whole build, and we're gonna cover the whole thing from going to the store and buying it, and we're gonna try and make it very, very beginner friendly. So buying it from the big box store, buying a cheap vise, doing things a little bit easier, a little bit simpler, and get a fully functional bench that you can knock down and take apart and store. So basics, building a bench without a bench. Should be kind of fun. It'll be interesting to see Sarah taking on her first project by herself.
Interesting to see if James can restrain himself from trying to take over the project.
Come on, babe, cut faster. Just give it to me.
Just gonna make you man the chat.
Yeah, those could be some interesting lives. Let's watch Sarah work, and I'll man the chat.
He doesn't read as fast as I do.
need a coffee fund. Well, on that note, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next week, hopefully on Tuesday, so we don't have that problem. But think about it.
I have to clue you in. So when you go back and read the chat where someone says they have because Tom said he had 35 drinks this episode, it became a contest to see how many times you would expand and contract.
Nice.
I didn't want to make you self-conscious while you were talking.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming, and until next time, have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye.
End.